The corner booth at Murphy's Bar had been his sanctuary for 3 years, a place where 77-year-old Navy SEAL veteran could sit quietly with his demons and a single beer that lasted all night. When the drunk construction crew decided he looked like easy prey, they pulled him from his seat and pummeled him while shouting insults about useless old men. But when their violence ripped his jacket apart, exposing a SEAL Team 6 tattoo with Neptune Spear underneath, the bartender dropped his glass in shock, because that ink belonged to the most classified warriors in American history. Murphy's Bar wasn't the kind of place that appeared in tourist guides or earned 5-star reviews. Located in the industrial section of Pittsburgh, it catered to construction workers, factory employees, and the forgotten souls who needed somewhere dark and anonymous to drink away their problems. The neon Budweiser sign in the window flickered intermittently, casting red shadows across cracked vinyl booths and a floor that had absorbed decades of spilled beer and broken dreams. In the corner booth, as far from the crowd as possible, sat a man who embodied invisibility itself. At 77, Thomas Phantom Rodriguez looked like every stereotype of a washed-up veteran rolled into one tragic package. His gray hair hung lank and unwashed. His clothes bore the permanent wrinkles of someone who slept in them, and his hollow cheeks spoke of too many meals skipped to afford the single beer that sat untouched on the scarred wooden table. What the bar's patrons didn't know was that Thomas Rodriguez had once been one of the most dangerous men alive. For 32 years he had served with Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DIV-GRU, that are known as SEAL Team 6. He had been part of the unit that eliminated Osama Bin Laden, had conducted over 200 classified operations across 4 continents, and had earned a reputation as Phantom because of his ability to appear and disappear without a trace. But that was decades ago, in a world that had forgotten him as completely as he wished he could forget it. Every Friday night for 3 years, Thomas had claimed the same corner booth. He would order a single Budweiser, nurse it for 4 hours, and sit in the relative anonymity that the bar provided. It wasn't about the alcohol. Thomas had learned long ago that drinking didn't solve problems. It only postponed them. It was about the noise, the chaos, the background din of other people's conversations that helped drown out the silence in his head. The silence where his fallen teammates' voices used to be. Tonight started like every other Friday. Thomas had walked the 6 blocks from his studio apartment above the Chinese restaurant, paid his $4 for the beer he wouldn't finish, and settled into his usual booth. The bar was busier than normal, a construction crew celebrating the end of a major project, their voices loud with alcohol and testosterone. Thomas paid them no attention. He'd learned to tune out the world around him, to exist in the spaces between other people's awareness. But tonight, the world wouldn't let him stay invisible. "Hey, look at that pathetic old bastard in the corner," came a voice that cut through the bar's ambient noise like a knife. Thomas didn't look up. He'd heard similar comments before. Usually, if he remained perfectly still and avoided eye contact, the speakers would lose interest and find other entertainment. But tonight was different. "I'm talking to you, Grandpa," the voice said, closer now. "You've been nursing that same beer for 2 hours. Either drink it or get out." Thomas finally looked up to see 5 men standing near his booth. Construction workers, still wearing their hard hats and safety vests, their faces flushed with alcohol and aggression. The speaker was a big man, probably in his 30s, with arms like tree trunks and the kind of swagger that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. "Just minding my own business," Thomas said quietly, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "Your business is depressing the hell out of everyone else," said another member of the crew, this one shorter but stockier, with mean eyes and scarred knuckles. "This is a place for real men to drink, not some nursing home for washed-up losers." Thomas looked around the bar, hoping someone might intervene. But the other patrons were either too drunk to notice or too intimidated to get involved. The bartender, a young man named Kevin, who had only been working at Murphy's for 6 months, was at the far end of the bar, wiping glasses and trying to pretend he didn't see what was happening. "I'll finish my beer and go," Thomas offered, reaching for the bottle with a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the medication he took for his war wounds. "No, you'll go now," the big man said, grabbing Thomas by the front of his worn jacket and hauling him upright. "We don't want to look at your pathetic face while we're celebrating." Thomas didn't resist as they dragged him from the booth. At 77, with arthritis in his joints and shrapnel still embedded in his left leg, he wasn't going to win a physical confrontation with 5 men half his age. The smart play was to leave quietly and find somewhere else to spend his Friday nights. But the construction workers weren't interested in letting him leave quietly. "Look at him," laughed the stocky one, shaking like a leaf. "What's wrong, old man? Scared?" "Please," Thomas said, the word coming out weaker than he'd intended. "I just want to go home." The word "please" seemed to ignite something savage in the construction crew. They'd found someone who would beg, someone who wouldn't fight back, someone they could hurt without consequences. "Please?" the big man mocked. "Did you hear that, boys? Grandpa's begging." That's when the real violence began. The stocky one shoved Thomas backward into a nearby table, sending empty beer bottles crashing to the floor. Before Thomas could recover, a fist caught him in the stomach, doubling him over and driving the air from his lungs. "This is what happens when you overstay your welcome," snarled the big man, grabbing Thomas by the hair and hauling his head up to meet a vicious right hook that snapped his head to the side. Thomas tasted blood and felt his vision blur, but the assault was just beginning. They surrounded him like a pack of wolves, taking turns throwing punches and kicks while he tried desperately to protect his vital organs. "Worthless old piece of shit," one of them spat. "Should have died years ago," added another. "Nobody wants you here," laughed a third. Thomas curled up on the sticky floor, trying to make himself small, trying to endure until they lost interest. But the beating continued, each impact sending fire through his aged bones and reopening wounds that had never properly healed. And then, in their enthusiasm to cause maximum pain, one of the attackers grabbed Thomas's jacket and used it to haul him upright for better access to his face. The fabric, already weakened by years of wear and the violence it had just endured, couldn't take the stress. The jacket tore with a sound like thunder, ripping wide across the chest and exposing Thomas's scarred torso to the dim lights of Murphy's bar. And there, etched deep into the weathered skin over his heart, was a tattoo that made the entire world stop turning. It wasn't the standard military ink that bar patrons might expect from a veteran. No eagles or flags or patriotic slogans. This was something far more specific, far more deadly. A SEAL Team 6 trident, black ink faded but unmistakable, and underneath it, in letters that had been burned into flesh during a classified ceremony 40 years ago, Neptune. The construction workers stared at the tattoo without understanding what they were seeing. But Kevin, the young bartender, understood immediately, because Kevin's grandfather had been a Navy man, and Kevin had grown up hearing whispered stories about the most elite warriors in the American military. He knew that Neptune Spear wasn't just any operation, it was the code name for the mission that killed Osama Bin Laden. The glass Kevin had been cleaning slipped from his trembling hands and shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet bar like a gunshot. "Jesus Christ," Kevin whispered, his voice carrying in the silence. "Do you know who you just beat up?" The construction workers looked at him with confusion, still standing over Thomas's prone form. "What are you talking about?" the big man demanded. Kevin couldn't take his eyes off the tattoo. "That's not just any veteran. That's SEAL Team 6. And that Neptune Spear marking?" His voice trailed off as the full implications hit him. "So what?" the stocky one said, but his voice lacked conviction. "So what?" Kevin's voice rose with incredulous anger. "Neptune Spear was the operation that killed Bin Laden. That man you just beat half to death is one of the operators who eliminated the most wanted terrorist in history." The effect was immediate and devastating. The construction workers stepped back from Thomas's still form as if he had suddenly become radioactive. Conversations throughout the bar stopped mid-sentence. Every eye in the place focused on the old man bleeding on the floor and the tattoo that revealed his true identity. "That's impossible," the big man said, but his voice shook. "He's just some homeless bum." "Look at him again," Kevin said, his voice hard with disgust. "Look at his scars. Look at the way he moves. Look at his eyes. That's not a homeless bum. That's a man who's killed more terrorists than you've had hot meals." Thomas was slowly pushing himself up from the floor, blood running from his nose and mouth. But despite the beating he'd just endured, there was something in his posture that spoke of decades of military discipline, a core of steel that violence couldn't break. "Sir," Kevin said, coming around the bar to kneel beside Thomas. "Are you all right?" Thomas looked at the young bartender with eyes that held too much history to be easily read. "I'll be fine," he said quietly. "Just need to get cleaned up." But Kevin wasn't about to let this go. He stood up and faced the construction workers with the kind of righteous anger that comes from witnessing injustice. "You five just assaulted a decorated war hero," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the bar. "A man who risked his life to keep this country safe. A man who has hands the right to sit wherever he wants, drink whatever he wants, and be left the hell alone." The big man tried to salvage some dignity from the situation. "We didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Kevin interrupted. "You saw an old man who looked poor and assumed he was worthless. You decided that gave you the right to beat him up for your entertainment." By now other patrons were gathering around, staring at Thomas with a mixture of awe and shame. Word was spreading through the bar in whispers. The quiet old man they'd all ignored was actually one of America's most elite warriors. "Is it true?" asked the woman who had been sitting at the bar. "Were you really part of the Bin Laden mission?" Thomas hesitated. Even after all these years, talking about classified operations felt wrong. But something about the situation, about the way these people were looking at him, called for honesty. "I was part of the team," he said finally. "But it wasn't just me. There were a lot of good men on that operation." "But you were there," another patron said. "You were actually there when it happened." Thomas nodded slowly. "May 2nd, 2011. Abbottabad, Pakistan. Operation Neptune Spear." The simple confirmation sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. They were in the presence of living history. A man who had been part of one of the most significant military operations of the modern era. Kevin turned back to the construction workers, who were standing in stunned silence. "You want to know what makes this even worse?" he said. "You didn't just beat up any SEAL. You beat up a man who was part of the most important counter-terrorism operation in American history. A man who helped bring justice for The stocky construction worker, who had seemed the most aggressive during the assault, looked like he was going to be sick. "We're sorry," he mumbled. "We didn't—" "Yes, you did mean it," Thomas said, struggling to his feet with Kevin's help. "You saw someone you thought was weak and decided to hurt them. The only thing you're sorry about is finding out you picked the wrong target." His words carried the weight of absolute truth, and none of the five men could argue with. Kevin was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the police. What you did was assault, and it needs to be reported." But Thomas raised his hand. "No police." Kevin looked at him in surprise. "Sir, these men attacked you. They need to face consequences." "They'll face consequences," Thomas said quietly, looking at the five construction workers with eyes that had once stared down terrorists. "Living with what they did tonight, knowing what kind of men they chose to become, that's consequence enough." The big construction worker, his earlier bravado completely gone, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, is there anything we can do? Any way we can make this right?" Thomas studied his face, looking for sincerity. What he saw was a man who had been forced to confront the worst parts of himself and didn't like what he'd found. "You want to make it right?" Thomas asked. All five nodded eagerly. "Then remember this moment. Remember how it felt to realize you'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and the next time you see someone who looks different, who seems vulnerable, who doesn't fit your idea of what's normal, remember that everyone has a story. Everyone deserves basic human dignity." The five men stood in uncomfortable silence, processing the lesson they'd just learned in the hardest way possible. Kevin helped Thomas back to his booth and brought him a towel and some ice for his injuries. "Your drinks are on the house from now on," he said. "For life." "That's not necessary," Thomas replied. "Yes, it is," Kevin said firmly. "It's the least we can do." As word of what had happened continued to spread through the bar, Other patrons began approaching Thomas's table, not to gawk or ask invasive questions, but to simply say thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for risking everything so they could live their lives in freedom. An older veteran who had been sitting alone at the bar came over and simply shook Thomas's hand. Vietnam, 6870, he said simply. Marine. Thank you for your service, Thomas replied, and the two men understood each other without needing more words. A young woman approached with tears in her eyes. My brother was killed in Afghanistan, she said. Thank you for making sure his death meant something. Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. But perhaps the most meaningful interaction came from an unexpected source. One of the construction workers, not the big leader, but one of the others who had stood by and participated in the beating, approached the booth with obvious reluctance. Sir, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I want you to know that I'm ashamed of what we did. Not just because of who you are, but because of what we became tonight. We became the kind of people who hurt others for fun. That's not who I want to be. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. What's your name, son? Danny? Danny Morrison. Well, Danny Morrison, you have a choice to make. You can let this moment define you as someone who participated in cruelty, or you can let it transform you into someone who stands up against it. Which man do you want to be? Danny nodded slowly. I know which one, sir. And I'm going to make sure I become that man. As the evening wore on, Murphy's Bar transformed from a place of violence and indifference into something resembling a community. Patrons who had never spoken to each other were sharing stories, buying each other drinks, and treating the quiet veteran in the corner booth with the respect he had always deserved. Kevin, the young bartender, found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories with new understanding. The old Navy man had always emphasized the importance of recognizing heroes among us, of understanding that courage often came in quiet packages that didn't advertise themselves. Mr. Rodriguez, Kevin said during a quiet moment. Can I ask you something? Thomas nodded. Why do you come here? I mean no offense, but this isn't exactly the nicest place in town. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Because it's noisy, he said finally. When you've lost as many friends as I have, silence becomes your enemy. The noise here helps drown out the voices of men who aren't coming home. Kevin felt his eyes well up. He'd never considered that perspective, that someone might seek out chaos, not because they enjoyed it, but because the alternative was unbearable. As closing time approached, the 5 construction workers gathered near the door, clearly wanting to leave but uncertain how to end the evening. Finally, their leader, the big man who had started the whole confrontation, approached Thomas's booth one last time. Sir, I know we can't undo what we did, he said, but I want you to know that you've changed us tonight. Not just because of who you are, but because of how you've handled this situation. You had every right to have us arrested, to make us pay for what we did. Instead, you chose to teach us something about forgiveness and dignity. He paused, struggling with words. I'm going to be a better man because of tonight. We all are. Thomas looked at him with eyes that had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. That's all any of us can do, son. Try to be better tomorrow than we were today. After the construction workers left, the bar began to empty, but several patrons made a point of stopping by Thomas's table to shake his hand or simply nod their respect. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas felt truly seen by the people around him. Kevin was cleaning up when Thomas finally stood to leave. Mr. Rodriguez, Kevin called out, I hope you'll keep coming here. This place is better with you in it. Thomas smiled. The first genuine smile he'd shown in years. I'll be back next Friday. Same booth, same beat. And anyone who has a problem with that will have to deal with me, Kevin said firmly. As Thomas walked home through the quiet Pittsburgh streets, he reflected on the strange turn his evening had taken. What had started as another anonymous night of trying to forget had become a moment of recognition, understanding, and perhaps even healing. For 3 years he had been invisible in that bar, just another forgotten old man nursing a beer he couldn't afford. But tonight he had been seen for who he really was, and more importantly, for who he had always been, a man of honor who had given everything for his country and asked for nothing in return. The next Friday, when Thomas entered Murphy's bar, something remarkable happened. Instead of the usual indifference, he was greeted with nods of recognition, offers to buy him drinks, and genuine smiles from people who now understood the quiet dignity of the man in the corner booth. Kevin had made good on his promise. Thomas's drinks were indeed free, but more than that, he had become an unofficial guardian of the bar's atmosphere. Anyone who showed disrespect toward other patrons found themselves in a conversation with Kevin about a 77-year-old veteran who had taught an entire bar about the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The 5 construction workers never returned to Murphy's bar, but Danny Morrison kept his promise. He began volunteering at a local veterans shelter, working to help homeless veterans find housing and support. When asked why he dedicated so much of his free time to the cause, he would simply say, "I learned something important about heroes not always looking heroic." Thomas's story spread beyond the bar. Kevin told his friends, the patrons shared it with their families, and soon the quiet veteran in the corner booth became something of a local legend. Not because people wanted to gawk at him, but because his story served as a powerful reminder about the dangers of judging people by their appearance. A local reporter heard about the incident and wanted to write a feature story, but Thomas politely declined the interview. He had spent his career operating in the shadows, and he preferred to keep it that way. But he did agree to speak at a local high school about the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. "Heroes don't always wear uniforms," he told the assembled students. "Sometimes they're sitting quietly in the corner, dealing with their own battles while asking for nothing from anyone else. Your job isn't to identify who's a hero and who isn't. Your job is to treat everyone like they might be." A year after the incident, Murphy's bar had been transformed from a rough dive into something approaching a neighborhood institution. The change wasn't in the decor or the menu, it was in the atmosphere. People looked out for each other, showed respect for differences, and understood that everyone who walked through those doors was fighting battles that others couldn't see. Thomas Rodriguez continued his weekly visits, but now he was no longer invisible. He was part of a community that valued his presence, respected his service, and understood that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. The corner booth was still his, but it was no longer a place of isolation. It was a place of honor. When Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. Not through his classified military service, which remained largely secret, but through the simple dignity with which he had handled a moment of violence and transformed it into a lesson about compassion and understanding. Kevin spoke at the service, describing how a chance encounter in a bar had taught an entire community about the importance of looking beyond appearances to see the true worth of every human being. The 5 construction workers were among the mourners, each having been changed by their encounter with a man who had chosen forgiveness over revenge. But perhaps the most fitting tribute was the small plaque that Kevin installed above Thomas's corner booth. "In honor of Thomas Phantom Rodriguez, who taught us that strength isn't about your ability to hurt others, but about your ability to forgive them when they hurt you." The Neptune Spear tattoo that had shocked a bar full of strangers had become a symbol of something larger, the recognition that heroes walk among us every day, often unnoticed and unappreciated, carrying their burdens in silence while asking for nothing more than basic human dignity. In Murphy's bar, that lesson lived on long after the man who taught it had found his final peace. And in a world that too often forgot to see the humanity in everyone, that might have been the most important operation Thomas Phantom Rodriguez ever completed.